Welcome back to another episode of the CSKA podcast. My name is Stuart O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast alternates between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I am unpacking the paper Culturally Responsive Sustaining CS Education, a Framework. This was developed by the Kapor Center. Now, this particular paper is a relatively short paper. It's only 14 pages, and it includes 6 core components for developing culturally sustaining, equitable, and inclusive K-12 computer science classrooms. Now, I highly recommend that you actually read this paper. So what I'm going to do is list these 6 core components and then give you a teaser for each one of the actionable things that you can do for the core components to encourage you to go take a look at this. Now, I do include a direct link to this in the show notes, which you can find by clicking the link in the description for the app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com and going to the podcast tab. If this particular podcast episode interests you, I highly recommend checking out the other resources on my website, or by going to bootuppd.org, which has a curriculum that I developed that uses many of these core competencies already within them. All right, so this particular paper starts off by discussing equitable access in relation to computer science as a foundational literacy. So here's a quote from page 3. Quote, "Prioritizing equitable access to computer science will help to address racial and economic disparities in the tech sector, drive creativity, innovation, and problem solving, prepare a diverse tech workforce to meet the future needs of our economy, and ensure students develop core computing literacies while understanding social, cultural, and political impacts of technology." Now, the authors note that there are many inequalities in computer science education that are ranging from inequalities around race or gender, socioeconomic status, geography, etc. And so they highlight some of the stats related to some of those different demographics or categories. So I recommend taking a look there. But then they also mention on page 3, quote, "Access alone is insufficient and significant disparities remain. We believe that a multi-pronged approach centering racial justice is required to ensure meaningful participation, success, and matriculation in computer science education for students from all demographic backgrounds to close racial, gender, and socioeconomic equity gaps. This approach must address foundational educational disparities, create equitable policies at the federal, state, and local levels, and invest deeply in the development of teachers, pedagogical practices, and curriculum that reflect and sustain students' cultures, experiences, and interests." End quote. So the next section of this paper mentions there are 2 main elements in this particular framework. So the first one is a shared definition of what culturally responsive, sustaining computer science classroom pedagogy is. And then the second one are the core components that I'll mention in a little bit. All right, so I'm going to read the full definition of culturally responsive, sustaining CS pedagogy, which is on page 5. Quote, "Culturally responsive, sustaining computer science pedagogy is situated within a context of racial, socioeconomic, and gender inequality in computer science education. It articulates a strategy to move beyond increasing access to computer science courses and ensure all students have the opportunity to be inspired and engaged in computing education, develop critical computational skills, and have equitable opportunities to pursue computing careers and contribute to technological innovation. Culturally responsive, sustaining computer science pedagogy ensures that students' interests, identities, and cultures are embraced and validated. Students develop knowledge of computing content and its utility in the world. Strong CS identities are developed, and students engage in larger socio-political critiques about technology's purpose, potential, and impact. Culturally sustaining computer science pedagogy includes the teacher's instructional practice, the curriculum, resources, and activities used in the classroom, as well as the instructional design practices utilized by the teacher. Culturally responsive, sustaining computer science instruction is necessary, but not sufficient to achieve equity in computer science education. It must be implemented alongside broader solutions to dismantle racism and inequality in education, employment, health, and the environment, all of which disproportionately negatively impact marginalized communities." End quote. All right, so now here are the core components. So here's all 6 of them from page 6. First one is acknowledge racism in CS and enact anti-racist practices. The second one is create inclusive and equitable classroom cultures. The third one is pedagogy and curriculum are rigorous, relevant, and encourage socio-political critiques. The fourth one is student voice, agency, and self-determination are prioritized in CS classrooms. The fifth one is family and community cultural assets are incorporated into CS classrooms. And the sixth one is diverse professionals and role models provide exposure to a range of CS and tech careers. All right, so I'm going to read their definition of the core component and then read one of the course of actions for each one of these components. There are multiple courses of actions for each of these, so this is just a teaser, because again, I highly recommend you actually take a look at this. All right, so core component 1, quote, the role of racism and white supremacy and its manifestation in computer science education is understood and acknowledged. Anti-racist practices and the decentering of whiteness are enacted within computer science courses and classrooms, end quote. Okay, so here's a course of action that they recommend. Both of these are from page 7. Quote, educators explore their own identities, racial, gender, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious, socioeconomic, etc., and positions of privilege and power or oppression, end quote. That is a course of action that I highly recommend, and I really appreciate that this is a core component to focus on anti-racism, but then they also mention exploring other identities. It's very important to not just focus on one form of inequality, but also think of other forms of privilege or power or oppression. So if I were to think of the things that they mentioned, like racial, gender, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious, and socioeconomic, some of those I am in a position of power or privilege, and then in some of those I am an oppressed person or a marginalized individual. And it's important to think about those different intersectionalities and how, depending on the context in which you're in, can have a different impact on whether or not you are a person of privilege or a person who is marginalized in different scenarios. This can then inform how you work with kids and the things that you discuss in your classes and the things that you share. Okay, so the second core component, this is also from page 7, quote, inclusive and equitable classroom cultures are co-created to cultivate meaningful learning experiences for students and ensure belonging for students from all backgrounds. Individual and collective identity exploration are utilized as tools to create inclusive classrooms, ensure belonging for all students, and ensure equity, end quote. Okay, so one of the course of actions on here, and there are 6, I'm only reading one, is, quote, educators help students explore their identities to develop CS projects that reflect their passions and interests, end quote. This is a huge action that I really focused on and talked about in like the Affinity Space podcast and create in not only the free resources on my website, but the free resources that I create for Boot Up, all about getting it so that kids can explore their passions and interests and share their understandings. That could be the forms of culture that are mentioned here, but it could also be other forms of culture and interest like gaming or sports or literature or whatever that kids can explore in their projects. So this one really stood out as a course of action that resonated with me, but I highly recommend checking out the others. All right, so core component 3, this is from page 8. Quote, pedagogy and curriculum is rigorous. Aligned to K-12 CS standards and high expectations are set for all students. Relevant, is authentic to students' experiences, interests, and cultures, and examines current and historical sociopolitical context within which CS is situated, end quote. By the way, that sounds a little weird reading it, but if you actually look at the text, it makes a little more sense because there's like the em dashes and whatnot. So, sorry, that was not me misreading it. It just sounds weird in REO format. All right, so here's one of the 4 course of actions for this particular component. Quote, educators support students in learning about the history of their respective communities, honor their ethnicities and cultures, and incorporate their cultures, interests, and passions into the learning process, end quote. Again, this relates to the last one that I mentioned, but I love this one. I love the idea of bringing in your understandings from outside of class where you might be an expert or a cultural bearer and bringing that into the things that you are learning about and creating in class. So if you're creating a Scratch project, cool. Bring in your understandings and your cultures and your interests into that Scratch project when you're creating it and share it with people in the rest of the class. All right, so core component 4, also from page 8, quote, student voice, student agency, and self-determination are valued, encouraged, and incorporated during the CS learning process. Student ideas and input are actively solicited from students to co-create classroom instruction, end quote. So here's one of the 3 actions that they recommend. Quote, educators engage students as emerging experts to lead activities, support peer-to-peer teaching and learning, and encourage ongoing feedback, end quote. These are from page 8. I love this. If you listen to the Affinity Space podcast or the Rhizomatic Learning discussions with Catherine Bornhurst, Katie Henry, and John Stapleton, we really talk about the importance of like co-constructing learning paths and whatnot with kids. So this really resonates with me. And if you haven't listened to those episodes and this component is of interest to you, which I hope it is, check out the show notes for links to those podcasts that I just mentioned. All right, so core component 5. This is from page 9. Quote, families and communities and their cultures and assets are incorporated into the design of CS curriculum, classrooms, and learning opportunities. Families and community members are intentionally sought out and included in the construction of CS classroom learning and activities, end quote. And here's one of the 4 courses of action. Quote, Educators align CS content and instruction with in-school and out-of-school experiences, cultures, and perspectives, end quote. I love the alignment with out-of-school in particular. Far too often I've seen specialist classes like a science class or a music class or a computer science class exist within this bubble or a silo where the things do not connect with what you are learning and engaging with or experiencing outside of the class. So I love this idea of connecting with the experiences, the cultures, perspectives, and whatnot outside of the classroom. So for example, in science class, the things that you're learning and the things that are valued and understood within that class might not be the things that are talked about in relation to science in some of the cultures that you grew up with. So it would be really interesting to talk about how those two can connect. All right, so the last core component, this is from page 9 as well. Quote, a diverse variety of experts are incorporated into the classroom, including researchers, community members, entrepreneurs, tech leaders, to intentionally expose students to a variety of computing professionals and careers. Specific efforts are taken to identify role models from diverse identities, backgrounds, careers, and trajectories. End quote. And here's one of the 4 actions that they recommend. Quote, educators actively seek out and recruit diverse guests and experts in representing underrepresented or marginalized groups in computing. End quote. Now, one of the things that I think is a good thing that has come out of the hybrid and remote instruction that we've done is it's become much easier for finding people who can remotely come in and speak to students. So now you can find guests all around the world, as long as time zones are permitting, and have them zoom into your classroom or virtually meet with your kids. So this is a great way, especially if you're in like a rural community and you can't have people physically come to your school or have your students physically go to a specific building where people work or something. You can have people zoom in and engage in these discussions remotely. So I highly recommend thinking of different ways that you can do that, whether it's a live, a synchronous thing, or asynchronous by recording a panel discussion or recording an interview that you do with a CS educator or professional or something where that person is from different cultures that might be represented in your classroom that you might not have experience or understanding of, quite like somebody who is a cultural bearer. All right, so the rest of the paper ends with some appendices, so some key terms, some references, and some resources to learn some more. So I highly recommend going and actually taking a look at this. You can find this on the Kapor Center's website, but you can also find this by going to the show notes, and I include a direct link over to this particular paper. Now, with each one of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I kind of like to end with some lingering thoughts or some questions. And I guess one lingering thought that I have, whenever I see people talking about culturally relevant education, a la Gloria Ladson-Billings, or culturally responsive education, a la Geneva Gay, there is a tendency for people to focus on one culture or one demographic rather than acknowledging the cultural pluralism that occurs within those discussions on those particular topics. So, for example, I love the fact that race is highlighted in here and that they are promoting anti-racist pedagogies. Totally on board for that. If teachers were to make progress by incorporating more anti-racist pedagogies into the classroom, that would be amazing. But we can't just end there. We also have to talk about the other isms that need to be addressed. For example, sexism, or the transphobia, or some of the inequalities with socioeconomic status, etc. So those phobias or isms or inequalities need to also be discussed in relation to the core components in here. But that being said, how you implement this is really up to you. So you could implement it by focusing on, hey, we're really going to focus on socioeconomic status and really try and improve that in our classroom for this next quarter. And the next quarter, we're really going to build off of that and try and focus on racism that might be occurring and really hone in on that. So basically treating these as units. That might be one approach that you might use. There's pros and cons to that, but that's one approach. Another approach might be, we're going to talk about all of these in relation to what is most relevant in that particular moment or unit or lesson or specific project, etc. That's another way of looking at this. And there are pros and cons to any of the approaches that you end up using. But the thing that I'm just encouraging is don't just focus on one. Because while you might focus on anti-racist practices, which is great, what about the trans individuals in your classroom? Or what about the kids who are low socioeconomic status, who don't have internet, don't have devices at home, etc.? Or what about the kids who don't speak English as their first language, or don't speak it at all yet? These are all forms of inequality that need to be addressed, and these components can assist with that. So my larger point being, I love this framework. I just give the caution of, make sure you're looking at this broadly, like through a kaleidoscope, rather than through a microscope where you focus on just one thing. Because there are many forms of marginalization and intersecting forms of marginalization and privilege that might be occurring within your particular classroom that you're working on. All right, so that rant is over. Anyways, I again really like this particular framework. I hope you go and take the time to read this. You can find the show notes by going to jaredoleary.com and checking out the hundreds of free resources on that website, if not thousands, or by sharing both this podcast and the paper to other CS educators who might not be aware of it. Thank you so much for listening to this particular episode. Stay tuned next week for another interview, and the following week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.